Well, I started work when I left school at the age of 15. I was bound apprentice for my father, but I often used to go to work with him at weekends as a schoolboy. And weekends, Mum would often get rid of me by taking Papa's lunch or so, and I'd spend Saturday and Saturday night there, quite an adventure for me, and come back Sunday morning.
Amazing.
So that was my first experience. So I learned to row, and I learned a bit about the shearing of barges, and that is to get them to move sideways through the tidal water, in much the same way that a kite held at an angle to an airflow can be made to advance towards the wind and overcome the force of gravity on the horizontal plane. Barges can be moved in the same way. The art of shearing is knowing exactly when to let go, and then having let go, you carry your way. It takes time for 250 tons of cargo in a barge. It takes time to slow down, and if you're pointing in the right direction, then you arrive at your destination. A licensed waterman was the man who was licensed to carry fare-paying passengers. Before 1514, when we really began, there was no licensing and no control, and many people were drowned as a result of being carried by men who applied for hire, and there was no control at all. And Henry VIII in 1514 decided it's time to have these men licensed. Each man was issued with a large plate worn on the upper arm with his number on it, and there were sort of beadles who would watch over everyone, making sure they did the right thing. And if you broke the rules with regard to proper payments and proper behaviour, your number would be taken and reported to the Watermen's Company, and you would suffer punishment of some kind. I was barge master to Her Majesty the Queen from 1978 to 1990, 12 years. Thomas Doggett was an actor, and the story goes that he acted in the early 1700s on the South Bank, and one night, on a very stormy night, there was a dearth of watermen to take him across the river. In fact, the only chap who appeared to be ready to do this was a young apprentice. And when Doggett asked him, why is it that you're out on a night like this? He said, well, when there are freemen around, they take precedence and I get nothing. So the only time I have a chance to earn a living is when the weather is so bad that most of them are at home.
Okay.
So he decided to institute a race to be rowed every year for all time, which is a considerable period. And the 300th race was rowed last year, of course, and this year rowed again. The 301st winner was young McCarthy, and no, not that. McCarthy won it last year, that's right. My great grandfather had a son who won it in 1832, Robert Waite, W-A-I-G-H-T, and that name has gone right through. The earliest time I can record a Waite was 1670.
So your
and that was listed in one of the books that was saved from the Great Fire of London. After the war, I worked as a lighterman because I felt, I liked the love. It's lovely. It's free. No one looking over your shoulder. At the end of the day, you ring up the boss and you tell him what your position is, and he tells you what you got to do. For some years, of course, much of the work was done by barges being towed by tugs who were themselves freemen of the River Thames. But when I started, the rowing of barges was the normal thing. Um, it's some people find it rather hard to believe that it is done. So you'll see me doing it on YouTube. Well, firstly, perhaps I should say that a licensed waterman carries fare-paying passengers, and the licensed lighterman is licensed to carry cargo. And the cargo is carried in barges. They're either dumb barges on their road, or they're motor barges, or they're sailing barges. And I have done all three and enjoyed much of it. You see, the tide goes 6 times as fast as you can row on the ebb, quite often. So you can only go downstream on the ebb tide and upstream on the flood. So the barge is adrift, shall we say, and left to its own devices is going to drift into all kinds of trouble. So you don't spend all your time rowing, but you do spend all your time considering which way have I got to go to get into that patch of water which will keep me clear of obstacles. In 1948, R.A. Butler introduced a bill into the House that allowed young people to be released to do 1 day a week or so in education, and advantage was taken of that by the lightship industry, and so apprentices started attending. I had them in their first year. When boys had been afloat perhaps 4 months, they would come along, and this was started in 1948. I felt there was a need for me to concentrate on safety precautions, because each year we lost a number of apprentices to drownings and accidents of all kinds, and it seemed such a shame that it should be. I felt that a boy would be one, working with possibly among a group of 30 men. And many of them, I believe, felt that what they knew was common sense, when in fact it was not. And so they would not realise that this boy needs to be told of that danger and that danger. And so I thought I could do something to make amends and talk about those things, you know, at the right time. And so I was able to give quite a lot of warning to boys. And it's fair to say, perhaps, that there must be 1 or 2 old boys of today who would not otherwise have become old boys, because the number of accidents was reduced quite dramatically. And I did that for 40 years. There came a time when I was able to spend some of that time afloat. And so for many young men, I was the man who introduced them to this business of barge rowing. We would hire a barge from some friendly barge owner, and we would pick it up perhaps at Wapping and row up to Hammersmith and have lunch and then row back. And they loved it. When they began their college course, invariably they would say, "When are we going for a drive?" Because that's what they wanted to do. They'd been listening to father and grandfather and great-grandfather sometimes talking about you boys of today, etc., etc., etc. And they did want to do it. And what I enjoyed most, perhaps, was saying, "Righto, Jonesy, you're next. You're going to take us through the next 2 bridges." And I would sit there looking over the side of the barge, pretending I wasn't taking any notice, and he would then order his friends and take command. And you can imagine going home, "Mr. Hunt allowed me to take her through Vauxhall and Lambeth." Great joy, you know. In other words, I've now joined the club, and don't go on about rowing barges, because I've done it. Great. So it was very, very popular. Yes, there was a reef of rock about 100 yards, shall we say, downstream from the current London Bridge. And it was on that reef that the old London Bridge was built, the Roman one, and then the one that lasted, some 400, 500 years. It had 19 arches, and quite a lot of damage was done to the bridge, so much so, in fact, that the battlements were protected by woodwork all around, and that reduced the width of the arches to such an extent that it was like a weir. Well, yes, of course, the tidal nature of our work has it decides, you know, what, when, and how you do things, and so to the school lever, it was so important. Say, well, strong northwesterly gales with low barometric pressure can push a tide up 3 feet higher than predicted in the tide tables. That's just one of 25. I'm not going to go through the rest. Oh yes, it's no good saying, oh well, the easterly wind is blowing, so we'll have extra water in the Thames. The opposite is true. Norwesterly gales blow a little extra water into the North Sea, and the behaviour of the tides in the North Sea is difficult to describe, but it can be done, but it's rather lengthy. I won't go into that now. But norwesterly gales, low barometric pressure. If you don't have very much pressure on a water airbed, then it stays. If you put pressure on it, down it goes. Low pressure, up it comes. So very, very low pressure and strong northwesterly gales mean that the tides in the North Sea behave rather badly. Fortunately today, there's sort of a consensus of information. All the nations, you know, Germany and the Netherlands and Belgium and France and Britain, we confer together and say, it looks, we had a record tide here, and you're likely to get it in 3 hours' time. Well, if the full moon was on the 8th, you say, oh, 2 days after, oh, it'll be a spring tide. That means about high water 3 o'clock at London Bridge. Yeah? So I hope that most of them could look at the moon and have a pretty good idea what time high water would be at London Bridge. Because the different times of high water occurs, you go downstream and as you go up. Okay? You find at Southend it's about an hour and a half before. So if you get a good high water at Southend, you know, an hour and a half later you're going to get a good high water at London Bridge. Earlier, if you've got an extra high water in Norfolk, then 6 hours later, it makes the job of the people at the Thames barrier much easier. If you have a record breaker in Norfolk, we're going to have a record breaker here in 6 hours' time. Right, stand by, lads. We'll be closing the river at a certain time, suitable time. Yes, there was a reef of rock about 100 yards, shall we say, downstream from the current London Bridge. And it was on that reef that the old London Bridge was built, the Roman one, and then the one that lasted, well, some 500 years. It had 19 arches, and quite a lot of damage was done to the bridge, so much so, in fact, that the battlements were protected by woodwork all around, and that reduced the width of the arches to such an extent that it was like a weir. In the early 1800s, it was decided that something would have to be done to take the old bridge down and to build a new one, because 2 hours after high water, it was quite common on a spring tide for the water on the upstream side to be 6 foot higher than on the downstream side. A Rhino barge was a special kind of invasion barge which had been produced as a result of problems in the Mediterranean. What they found was that what was needed was a shallow vessel to go into places where there was a very gradual approach to the beach. The Germans knew that we would rely on, we had about 1,000 LSTs altogether. The landing ship tanks, they were the ones you recognise them possibly. They have a door and a ramp in the bow. about 350 foot long. They were 3 foot deep at the front and 9 foot deep at the back. Ideal for going onto a beach of a slope of 1 in 50 or 1 in 40. But in other places, of course, they couldn't be at all. Now, one of the reasons Normandy was chosen by our people was that it was not a good beach for landing ships. And we knew that the Germans knew that it was not a good beach for landing ships. And as a result, it was relatively lightly defended. The good beaches, which had a slope of 1 in 30, they were all very heavily defended, and I dread to think what would have happened if we tried to land there. Well, we manned the craft, but the decisions, the important decisions had been made that we would go where the Germans believed we would not, because Normandy really was lightly defended, because it had, the approach to the beach had a slope of 1 in 300. And the beach itself, a slope of about 1 in 30, 1 in 40, meant that the only time we could possibly go to Normandy and land with landing ships and get rid of our cargo straight away would be on a brief 2 or 3 hours around high water springs. At high water nips, it would be no good going. At any other time than high water springs, an LST would be approaching the beach, would run aground on what we called the flats, the approach, with 9 foot of water at the back and 8 foot at the front. They would have to sit there, sitting ducks, and wait an hour and a half or so for the water to drop before they could discharge their cargo. You can't get rid of vehicles in 8 foot of water. So it was decided that that's where we would go, and that the last mile would be done by shallow craft. They were called the ferry fleet. Now, the smallest of the ferry fleet was the LCM, landing craft mechanized. They could carry 1 lorry. Now, the Rhino ferries were huge floating platforms, 180 feet long, 42 foot wide, and only 5 foot from bottom to top. They were made up of 180 separate steel boxes. Each box measured 5 feet by 5 feet by 7. They were joined together to form this floating platform, 2 engines at the back and a ramp at the front. So we, when loaded with vehicles, or for ambulances for instance, we could carry 40 ambulances in one trip. That was half an LSD's load. They were that size and that shape, so that 2 runs we could empty an LSD. The night before D-Day, we were in the Solent, and we left towed by an LSD. Each one of my Rhinos, I had 15 altogether. Each one was towed by the LSD on its stern anchor wire, towed across the channel, and then on D-Day morning, as we approached the beach, there came a time when a mile offshore, a mile and a half perhaps, we came to a stop. We would be put aboard the Rhino. The ship would put his stern anchor on his anchor wire, and then the 2 vessels would join up together. This had been practiced in exercises at Hailing Island and other places, so we had a pretty good idea what was required. The only difference between the exercises and the real thing was the weather was atrocious, and often our gears just carried away and we had to improvise. When wires and tackles broke, then we had to sort of chain ourselves to the ship, and that was done. So we would load up, take half the LSD's load, run into the beach and get rid of them as quickly as possible. Now, the Germans, when Rommel was put in charge of the Atlantic Wall just 12 months earlier, he arrived and said, "Why isn't this beach defended?" And they said, "Well, they won't come here because," and he said, "They will come here where we least expect it." And he said, if they can only come at high water, then 70,000 pit props, posts, strong posts, would be put into the beach just before the beach proper, just near high water time. Three of my rhinos, which of course were unsinkable, actually sat on mines. Those teller mines which had been fixed to the top of those pit props in the preceding months, some of them had come adrift, got into the sand and had been washed all over the place. Not possible to tell where they might be. And I happened to be on a Rhino with Sergeant Major Arthur Newcomb. We'd been boat boys together. We'd been 15-year-old apprentices. And there we happened to be on the Rhino when she sat on the mine. And fortunately, it went up in the middle and there was no one there and no casualties at all. Big dark green smoke came up, and when we got up off the deck, a quick body count meant that we were all there. Large hole in the middle. They just carried on with the hole in the middle. Last year, on the 70th anniversary, the French government decided that men who had been in Normandy and engaged in the fighting there, they should be made Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur. And quite a number, we have been waiting for it. And on Saturday, just 3 days ago, my medal arrived, and I was very, very pleased. Each man had a choice. It could only be given to men who were there at the time. It was not to be awarded posthumously, so that one's family or children could not claim. So I've made every effort to discover if there's another lighterman who served in Normandy, but so far I've been unsuccessful. So I now believe that I am the last lighterman of 500 to serve in Normandy. And at the age of 95, I think it's becoming increasingly more likely. So I've decided that it would not be delivered to me by the local ambassador's representative, but it would be presented to me by the Watermen's Company, and I've been made a guest at lunch at the end of the month, and that'll be a very special occasion because I will be there on that day representing the 500 who were not. There were 64 rhinos altogether, American and British, and in 4 months they put ashore 93,000 units, that's tanks, guns and vehicles, and 440,000 tons, nearly 500,000 tons of military stores. Now the Germans ran out of materials with which to wage war. They ran out of fuel. The Air Force had so much to do with that. Half our bomber crews never came home. They knocked out the factories, making the ball bearings and the armaments. And so the defenders of the Dutch cities and eventually the German cities ran out of material. So the Rhinos had that very useful role and they played it well. I'm so proud of my 120 men who manned the Rhinos. But of course when the war moved on to Antwerp and Mulby Harbour became less important, they wanted a shorter run, my company moved up to Belgium, and I was told that someone in Warpus had discovered more men were drowned on D-Day than were shot. And it was wise, they thought, that a riverman should assist the Chief Engineer's Second Army, Brigadier Ginger Campbell, advise him on how to cross rivers. Little did they know that this riverman was a 19-year-old apprentice when he joined the army. Fortunately, in September, a very, very fine and brave Dutch engineer of the Dutch State Waterways, Constant Lambrechtsen, joined the British Army at great risk to himself, because as his country had given in, he had sort of become a terrorist. And when we were in the forward areas, and we were quite often, had we been captured, I would have been made a prisoner of war, but he would have been shot. And as we were RE intelligence, knowing what was going to happen in the future, no doubt he would have been tortured first. But he had that courage. But at the time, what appealed to me was his skill. He was a degree engineer, knowing so much about the behaviour of water. I supplied the military background and the military knowledge, knowing something about the equipment that was available, having done quite a bit of bridging. And so together we were responsible for what is laughingly called the opposed crossing of water obstacles. Armoured divisions in the opposed crossing of water obstacles. In October, I was in the city of Sertogenbosch, because Constant Lambrechtsen told the brigadier that in 1940, all the very, very good maps had been hidden from the Germans, the maps which had the spot heights, such important information for us to know the height of everything when you're in the water level business. And so I had the job of going there to find someone who would take me to these hidden maps. And so I eventually, at the end of the day, was able to lay them in front of Constant and say, well, and he was so delighted. Months later, when it was planned to cross the River Maas at a place called Gennep, there was snow everywhere. The river was not quite 300 meters wide, and we were asked, how wide will it be in 12 days' time when the assault will take place? And we worked on it together, and he came up with the decision that the snow was melting and the rain was coming. The Germans had breached one of the exits of the Schwammenau Dam, part of the Siegfried Line defences. That flood water would go into the River Roer, which eventually, 3 days later, would arrive at Gennep, and the river would overflow its summer banks from dike to dike. But more importantly, there would be enough water to float pontoons. And so we were able to tell the brigadier that on February the 10th, the river will be 1,222 meters wide. And he said that would be a record. Now, his faith in Lambrechtsen was such that he said, very well, 140 bridging lorries were loaded, ready for the assault to take place. And as soon as the area was clear, then the Royal Engineers went in, and it took a week. And indeed, the river was, from dike to dike, enough water to float pontoons. It was decided it would cross exactly where a ferry had existed. And so that when eventually this bridge settled down onto the grass, except for the middle bit, those pontoons could be taken up towards the Rhine for us to use for the bridging of the Rhine at Xanten. So it's a very successful job. Normally, floating bridges do not have a name, but the brigadier always referred to it as Lambrechtsen Bridge. I've managed to get some Dutch people who do appreciate their gratitude is quite enormous. And it's likely that we will be able to install a park bench on each end to mark the ends of the bridge, this record breaker, with a very fine notice praising the skill and courage of Lieutenant Constant Ludovic Marius Lambrechtsen van der Litte.
And you've kept in touch with his family?
Yes, I was with his daughter on, just before Sergamos Liberation Day. It was the 27th of October, and we spent a lovely 4 hours together chatting about Papa on the 25th.
Very special occasion.
Yeah. Lovely Annalise Lombrecht Ornstein. Yeah. Yes, if I can read it quick. This document must not fall into enemy hands. That's right. So, if you know any enemy, don't let them know. Operations, military training pamphlet number 23, part 8, infantry and armoured divisions in the opposed crossing of a water obstacle, 1942. This pamphlet supersedes the 1940 edition. Yeah. For reconnaissance and infantry assault, for Bren carriers, trucks at 1300, methods of crossing, recovery, replacement of bridging equipment. So many things to think about. That kept us busy. Very few days did we finish before midnight. The brigadier would sometimes come to and say, "Gentlemen, perhaps we have had enough this evening," and then we'd go. Yeah, wonderful man. He eventually finished up in charge of the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, as General Campbell. Yeah. Yes, there was, before I came afloat, in 1929, people were drowned in Lambeth when they had high water. Then there was the classic 1953 flood, when 300 people were drowned in this country, over 2,000 in the Netherlands. People were drowned in Canby Island, you know, in our own area. And it was the result of sort of spring tides, low pressure, northwesterly gales that caused this extra. And of course, it's about time we were due another one, isn't it? Because there's far more water in the world today as a result of global warming. So there's less ice in the North Pole, far less ice there. So people in some of the Pacific islands find that their island has been reduced 50%. And how long will it be before they will be able to stay there? It's a great problem. So any time now we can expect, but the Thames is better prepared for it than it had been hitherto. Well, because of the barrier, London has considerable protection, but the people along the East Coast, you know, they're worried because it's so, there's erosion each time, especially in Norfolk, in the areas of Cromer. They have quite a lot of erosion, and in Essex, of course. So it is a problem, and let's hope that countries the world over will recognise that they need to do something about global warming and reducing the cause of it. One of the first things that came to my mind was when I saw the equipment, the method of coping with the tide rise and fall. I was surprised and very interested. What a novel way that this thing should slide up the slope rather than ride up and down on stilts. You know, in the Mulberry Harbour we had sort of spud piers which had 4 legs, like 4 posters. So the legs were embedded in the ground and the pontoon slid up and down. Well, and I thought, what difficulties there would be there. Then when I saw the diagrams, and it said that it would be on a triangular thing which slid up a novel. But one thing that I thought, these cyclists, the great advantage is that they could get aboard this deckway and cycle to their destination without a stop. No traffic lights. How many cyclists are killed in London each month? See, it would reduce those numbers. Well, one of my daughters lives in Portugal, and the place is full of, you know, the windmills. 40% of all their energy is supplied by solar and wind power. 40%, tremendous. Now, I've always wondered, I think Tower Pier itself must weigh about 2,000 tons, because quite a lot has been done with wave movement, sort of this up and down wave-like motion. But when you think of millions of tons going into an area and going out again, not linked to any turbines, it's amazing. Little places like Doggett, just downstream from Tower Bridge on the south shore, there's a little dockway, and it's full of mud, you know. Let it fill up, and when it comes out, turn the little propeller. But there we are, it's not. But certainly piers going up and down, not doing any work, has surprised me. But then,
that's a very interesting
I'm a lighterman.
thought.